She came to the office quietly, dressed modestly, carrying no title, just grace. But when one entitled coworker crossed the line in the most humiliating way, thinking she was just another nobody, what happened next silenced the entire company. Subscribe. Too Simply Stories for more jaw-dropping, true-style stories. She entered the building like a quiet breeze, graceful, steady, and unnoticed. Every afternoon around the same time, she walked through the glass doors without fanfare. There was nothing flashy about her, no designer heels clicking against the marble floor, no glinting badge around her neck, no entourage waiting to announce. She wore simple clothes, pressed but modest, and carried only a small bag on her shoulder. To most, she appeared like someone waiting for a ride or dropping off paperwork, just another visitor passing through the lobby. But day after day, she returned. At first, no one paid her much attention. Offices like this were full of important-looking people with forgettable faces and forgettable-looking people with surprising influence. But the longer she kept appearing, the more whispers began to stir. Some speculated she was a temp worker, or someone's assistant. Others assumed she was lost and too proud to ask for help. But no one asked her anything directly. No one even bothered to learn her name. They just stared when they thought she wasn't looking. The office itself was sleek, polished concrete floors, glass conference rooms, expensive abstract art hanging on the walls. It was the kind of place where titles meant everything and appearances mattered even more. Among the staff, there was a clear hierarchy, and at the top sat the so-called elite, well-dressed, well-spoken, confident to the point of arrogance. They moved through the space with the entitlement of royalty, and anything or anyone that didn't match their image was treated with suspicion or disregard. The black woman didn't fit that image. She wasn't loud, flashy, or visibly ambitious. She didn't try to force herself into conversations or suck up to the managers. Instead, she smiled politely in the break room, greeted the receptionist each day with warmth, and even held the elevator for people who barely acknowledged her. She wasn't invisible, but the people around her acted as if she was. One of the elite workers, in particular, seemed especially irritated by her presence. They never said it aloud, but it was written all over their face. Every time the woman passed by, there was a dismissive glance or a tight-lipped sneer. The elite worker began to act as if her mere existence was an inconvenience. They'd roll their eyes if she stood near them in line, sigh dramatically if she took too long at the vending machine, and once even slammed a file drawer extra hard when she was walking past, just to startle her. None of it was overt harassment, just small, deliberate moments of cruelty designed to remind her she didn't belong. But she never reacted. She continued to carry herself with quiet dignity. She never returned a glare, never snapped back, never complained. Her calmness only seemed to further agitate the elite coworker, as if her refusal to be shaken was somehow insulting. Over time, the aggression grew bolder. There were whispered jokes that she could hear, not-so-accidental shoves when passing in the hallway, and even food wrappers left at the seat she usually took in the cafeteria. Still, she said nothing. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. It was a busy Thursday, and the cafeteria was full of chatter and clinking coffee cups. The woman sat alone at a table near the window, a small black coffee in her hand. Out at the city's skyline, calmly, seemingly lost in thought. She wasn't bothering anyone. But the elite coworker spotted her and instantly bristled. With a group of colleagues nearby, they made no effort to hide their irritation. They stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing a decision. "Hey, Dan." With a huff, they walked over to her table. The room didn't go silent, but a few people glanced over, sensing tension. The elite coworker stood over the woman, arms folded, and muttered something under their breath, something cruel, sharp, and dripping with disdain. The woman slowly turned to look at them, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to defend herself. She simply looked up and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Excuse me?" The elite coworker smirked and repeated the comment louder this time, clearly trying to provoke her. A few people nearby paused their conversations, but still, The woman didn't rise to their level. She gave a quiet nod, folded a napkin over her cup, and began to gather her things as if to leave. The coworker laughed mockingly and added a final insult. Something about how people like her didn't belong in this kind of place. In that moment, something subtle shifted in the air. The woman paused. She looked up again, not with anger, but with something deeper, something stronger. Her eyes locked with theirs, and she said calmly, "One day you'll regret this." Then she stood up and walked away, her back straight, her dignity untouched. The cafeteria buzzed quietly again, but the tension lingered. No one said anything out loud, but people exchanged looks. A few started to wonder, who was she really? Why did she come here every day? More importantly, why did she handle all of this with such restraint? But one person didn't wonder at all. The elite coworker laughed as she left, completely unaware that they had just made the biggest mistake of their career. The office was tense that morning. A slow-moving storm of deadlines, missed calls, and unread emails pressing down on everyone's mood. But no one wore the weight of it more bitterly than the elite coworker. Their stress was etched across every stiff movement, the way they slammed drawers shut, snapped at junior staff, and paced across the office floor like every second was an offense. The pressure of their self-importance, combined with the unspoken belief that the world owed them more than it was giving, brewed into an invisible but volatile energy. By lunchtime, their mood had only worsened. A deal they'd been working on fell through. Their name had been left off a high-level meeting invite. Someone forgot their coffee order. All trivial things, but in their mind it built into a narrative of disrespect, of being undervalued and overlooked. So when they entered the cafeteria and saw her, the same black woman, sitting quietly again in their usual seat, ignited something deep and petty. The fuse was lit, and it burned fast. There she was again, calm, poised completely, unaffected by the chaos around her. She sat with a small meal in front of her, one hand resting gently on the table, the other stirring a tea with slow precision. She wasn't loud, she wasn't demanding space. And yet, to the elite coworker, her very presence was a challenge, a quiet defiance against the unspoken social order they believed they controlled. Without hesitation, they stormed over. Their footsteps were sharp, deliberate, drawing attention from nearby tables. A few employees paused mid-bite, sensing that familiar tension from last week, the one that had ended in awkward silence and cold stares. "You're in my seat." The elite coworker snapped, standing over her like a warden. Arms crossed, the woman looked up slowly, her expression soft but alert. There was no panic in her face. No trace of fear or defiance, just a patient understanding that something was about to unfold. "I didn't realize this was assigned," she replied gently, already beginning to gather her things. "If it's important to you, I can move." That response, so calm, so polite, only enraged the coworker further. It wasn't the answer they wanted. They wanted an argument, scene, something to justify their brewing anger. But her grace was infuriating. It made them feel powerless, irrelevant. And that was something their ego couldn't bear. "Of course it's important to me," they sneered. "People like you don't understand how things work around here. You don't just walk in and act like you belong." The words hung in the air, louder than intended. The room fell quieter. Someone at the next table stopped, mid-scroll on their phone. Another person lowered their sandwich. The woman paused, her hand still holding her cup. She looked up again, this time a little deeper, her eyes meeting theirs with a calm that could cut glass. "I didn't mean to cause offense," she said softly, her tone steady. "I'll be on my way," but that wasn't enough. It's not for the coworker. They looked down at the open can of Coke in their hand, an afterthought they'd grabbed moments earlier from the vending machine. In a split second of reckless impulse, they lifted it and flung the contents directly at her. The brown liquid splashed across her blouse, soaking her shoulders and chest, dripping down her arms and onto the floor. The sound of the impact echoed louder than it should have. A few people gasped. Someone dropped their fork. At least one phone was now recording. The woman stood up, stunned, but not frantic. Her clothes clung wetly to her body, but she made no move to brush it off. Silly, Didn't cry out, didn't yell, didn't curse. Instead, she stood silently, her posture perfect, her chin slightly lifted. All eyes were on her now. The coworker, chest heaving, looked around as if expecting applause or at least agreement. But the silence that followed wasn't supportive. It was tense, embarrassed, heavy. Still, they doubled down. Maybe now you'll remember this isn't your place. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I hope you know who I am." There was no threat in her voice, no bravado, just a quiet, weighty truth sitting behind her words. The coworker laughed, loud and dismissive. "Yeah, and who are you supposed to be?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She slowly picked up a napkin, dabbed the front of her shirt, and turned to leave the cafeteria. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. Her presence lingered long after her steps faded from the room. Coworker sat down in the now empty seat, still breathing heavily, trying to act like they'd won something. But the energy in the room had shifted. Nobody was laughing. Whispers began to stir almost immediately. "Did you see that? Wasn't she just trying to be polite? Why would you throw a drink on someone over a seat? Did you hear what she said before she left? Do you think she's someone important?" Someone replayed the video on their phone quietly under the table. Others glanced at each other, eyes wide, unsure of what they had just witnessed, but sure that they had seen a line crossed. A big one. Back at her desk, the receptionist looked toward the elevators with a stunned expression. A junior employee from accounting, who had once chatted briefly with the woman, whispered to his desk mate, "Something tells me that wasn't just some random visitor." The elite coworker sat alone, sipping the last of the now empty Coke can, still oblivious to the chain of events they had just unleashed. A storm was coming, and they didn't even see the clouds forming. The woman left the office without saying another word. Not to the receptionist, who had always greeted her with a kind smile. Not to the assistant, who had stood frozen with shock in the cafeteria. She stepped into the elevator, the liquid still dripping down her sleeve, and exited the building without turning back. There was no grand reaction, no threat made, no call to management, just silence. But somehow, that silence echoed louder than any outburst ever could. The following morning, a heavy hush fell over the entire office. People filed into work slower than usual, eyes darting cautiously as they passed one another. The whispers started. Early, every conversation seemed to circle back to one phrase: the Coke incident. No one knew the full story, but the video had started making its way through inboxes and group chats overnight. Grainy phone footage just long enough to show a can flying through the air, brown soda staining a blouse, and a calm voice saying, "I hope you know who I am." By 9:30 a.m., the tension was unbearable. People kept checking their email, refreshing their screens every few minutes, as if waiting for some kind of official response. And then it came an internal message with the subject line, asterisk, asterisk, mandatory. All staff meeting, 10 a.m. sharp, asterisk, asterisk, no explanation, no details. Just the location, the main conference room. Within minutes, every floor was buzzing. When the clock struck 10, the doors to the massive glass-walled conference room opened. Employees shuffled in one by one, unsure whether to feel nervous or curious. The senior staff sat up front. Interns hovered at the back. The room filled quickly, voices quieting as eyes focused on the front table. The CEO was already seated, a serious man known for being both private and exacting. He rarely attended meetings like this unless something major was happening. He wore a crisp suit, his expression unreadable, hands folded tightly on the table. But it wasn't just his presence that caught everyone's attention. It was the woman sitting beside him. There she was again, the black woman from the cafeteria. But today, she looked entirely different. Gone were the modest clothes and soft demeanor. She now wore a sharp, tailored navy suit. Her hair was styled elegantly, her heels clicked with precision when she crossed the room. She sat upright beside the CEO, composed and regal, eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. For a moment there was confusion. Whispers passed quickly between rows. Why was she sitting with the CEO? Was she his assistant? An executive? A board member? And then realization began to dawn. Pieces clicked together. And when the CEO stood, everything stopped. He cleared his throat slowly, letting the silence stretch across the room like a drum roll. Then he spoke. "Before we begin today's agenda," he said, his voice deep and unwavering, "I want to introduce someone very important to me." He turned slightly and gestured toward the woman beside him. "This is my wife." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Mouths opened. Eyes widened. Some people gasped audibly. Others froze completely. Chairs creaked under the weight of disbelief. A junior associate dropped her pen. At the front of the room, the elite coworker visibly tensed. Their jaw clenched, their hands curled into fists. Color drained from their face. The CEO looked around the room, letting the impact of his words settle. Then he reached down and pressed a button on the laptop in front of him. A projector screen lit up on the wall behind him, and the video began to play. There it was, the footage clear and damning. The cafeteria, the confrontation, the coke flying through the air, the woman standing soaked, dignified. The now infamous words, asterisk, "I hope you know who I am." Asterisk, no one made a sound. It's not a whisper, not a cough. No, just the quiet buzz of the speakers. As the video ended, and the CEO turned back to the room, "This," he said slowly, "is what happens when we forget human decency. When we judge someone based on assumptions, on clothing, on skin, on silence." He let the words hang in the air. "My wife has spent weeks observing this office not as an executive, not as my partner, but as a guest, watching, listening, learning how people are treated when they are perceived as having no power. What she experienced was eye-opening." He paused, then his eyes locked on the elite coworker. The room seemed to contract around that single moment. "There are consequences," he said firmly, "for behavior like yours, for cruelty, for arrogance, for cowardice masked as confidence." He gestured toward security at the door. "You no longer work here." The coworker didn't speak, didn't move. It was as if the world had stopped spinning around them. Security approached silently, respectfully. No one laughed. No one gloated. It wasn't a scene of revenge. It was justice, carried out quietly and firmly, like the sound of a door locking. As the disgraced coworker was escorted out, the CEO turned back to the rest of the room. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "We are a company of innovation, yes, but more than that, we must be a company of humanity. Titles and roles don't matter if we lose our character. If we cannot treat each other with dignity, we have failed no matter what numbers are on the spreadsheets." He then looked to his wife. She gave a quiet nod. The room remained silent, but a few people blinked away tears. The receptionist clutched her notepad a little tighter. The intern near the back straightened his posture, as if something within him had changed. The CEO concluded, "From this day forward, we will hold each other accountable, not just for results, but for respect," stepped away from the podium, and the woman stood beside him. Together they exited the conference room, leaving behind a company that would never forget the moment the truth dropped like a bomb. The entire office watched in silence as the elite coworker was escorted out. No one dared to speak. No one rushed to defend them. Even those who had once shared jokes or whispered judgments alongside them now sat frozen in disbelief. It wasn't just about the coke anymore. It was about what the act had represented and checked. Pride, blind cruelty, and the illusion of superiority that had lingered too long in corners of the company. The fall from grace happened quickly, but it struck deep. The sound of the glass doors closing behind the coworker was final, like a seal on a chapter that everyone knew had needed to end. After a few seconds of silence, the woman who had once quietly sipped tea in the cafeteria now stood tall before the room. Her expression was gentle, not triumphant. There was no gloating in her eyes, no satisfaction in revenge. Just the quiet strength of someone who had always known who she was and no longer needed to hide it. She looked across the room, making eye contact with several stunned faces. Then she spoke. "I came here without a name tag, without status, without expectation," she began, her voice calm and clear. "I wanted to see this place for what it really was, not just on paper, not in reports or investor decks, but through the eyes of someone who had no power, no title, and no reason to be treated well, other than being human." Her words landed with weight. A few employees lowered their eyes. Others stared at her with new understanding, shame flickering across their faces. "I've worked beside my husband for years," she continued, quietly, behind the scenes. "I've helped make hiring decisions. I've advised on policy. I've sat in on strategy sessions, reviewed quarterly goals, and led philanthropic outreach. I know this company. I know what it says it values." What I wanted to see for myself was whether those values lived in these halls or just in our marketing. She took a breath. No one moved. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause for her. Culture is not what we write on posters or announce in memos. It's not in the mission statements or the keynote speeches. Culture is what happens in the small moments when someone thinks no one is watching. It's how we treat each other in elevators, in lunch lines, in passing conversations. It's what you say to someone you believe has no power over you. There was no anger in her voice. It's just a steady truth that left no room for excuses. The CEO stood beside her once again and announced that effective immediately, the company would undergo a complete review of its internal culture. New ethics training would be mandatory across all departments. Anonymous reporting systems would be expanded and empowered. And leadership, at every level, would be held accountable not just for performance, but for behavior. "This is not a punishment," he said firmly. "This is a reset, a reminder of who we claim to be, and a promise to become better." Over the following days, the building felt different, quieter, more thoughtful. People moved through the halls with new awareness. Conversations became softer, greetings more sincere. And then the video leaked. It wasn't clear who shared it first. Maybe someone in the room, maybe a friend of a friend. But within a day, the footage was on social media, gaining views by the thousands, then the millions. The world watched as a calm woman in a cafeteria was humiliated, and then quietly rose. They watched as a CEO introduced his wife and fired a high-ranking employee without raising his voice. There were no dramatic outbursts, no lawsuits. Just truth, dignity, and accountability, captured in a few powerful minutes. The public reacted swiftly. Comment sections filled with praise for the woman's grace and restraint. People admired how she never yelled, never struck back, never tried to humiliate her aggressor. They celebrated the CEO's decision to stand beside her, not just as a husband, but as a leader who practiced what he preached. News outlets picked up the story. Workplace advocates highlighted the incident as a lesson in modern leadership. Even rival companies took note. Back at the office, something began to shift. Employees who had once ignored her started stopping by her husband's office, asking if they could pass along a message. Some sent emails. Others requested short meetings not to save face, but to apologize sincerely. A junior analyst admitted to once laughing at a joke made behind her back and now felt deeply ashamed. A department manager confessed they had suspected things were off, but stayed silent. And a group of interns, eyes wide with admiration, thanked her for showing them that quiet strength could be the loudest voice in the room. She received every message with kindness. She never brought up the incident again. She didn't reference the Coke, the video, or the coworker's name. What she did do, however, was listen. She met with departments to talk about empathy, inclusion, and accountability. Not in corporate terms, but through real conversations, human conversations. She reminded everyone that change isn't in policy, it's in practice. 1 year later, the company looked different. The toxic undercurrent that once flowed quietly beneath the surface had dried up. New hires came from more diverse backgrounds. Exit interviews were honest and actionable. Annual reviews included questions about team behavior and respect. Departments began organizing peer recognition days. A meditation room was opened. Leadership began office hours for any employee to speak freely without hierarchy. Most importantly, kindness became the standard, not the exception. Their reputation in the industry grew. Clients praised not only their work, but the values they stood for. Competitors tried to replicate the shift, but few understood the core of what had made it possible. It wasn't just the ethics training or the policy changes. It was her. She never asked for credit, never took a title, but she remained an advisor, a presence, and a compass. And through it all, she never raised her voice. She never had to. Strength wasn't in dominance. It was in her presence, her clarity, her refusal to become bitter even when she had every reason to be. She had shown an entire company what power truly looked like. Not loud, not boastful, but steady and unshakable. And in every hallway she walked, every elevator she stepped into, in every meeting she sat through from that day on, one ever looked at her the same way again,